Hi guys, welcome to another Wisdom Wednesday topic, and today we're going to be talking about foot and ankle conditioning for jumping athletes. Now today's case study is going to focus initially on netball, which is what this case study was initially designed for, but is equally applicable to basketball, other jumping sports, probably not so much volleyball, just for perspective of if we're talking beach volleyball, it's a slightly different surface. But anyway, let's dive straight in. So in terms of needs analysis of jumping sports, there's going to be some sprinting, change of direction and jumps, all which place a large amount of stress on the foot and ankle. In netball specifically, you've got anywhere from 4 upwards of 15 times body weight, depending on how elite the athlete is, how much force and speed they can produce, and especially if we're talking about netball, whether there's a rotation in the air, which we know a lot of top teams will do in order to be able to catch and manipulate and make the most of the footwork rule and travel with the ball. So there's a heavy emphasis on deceleration, stopping and landing mechanics. The ability to reduce force, the ability to land efficiently is going to obviously optimize that force when the foot hits the ground. This is why ACLs, the mechanism of injury obviously is the foot's planted one way, then you end up with the hip going into internal rotation, and then especially if the foot gets caught in the ground, this is where bad things are going to happen. Stress fractures particularly, especially if we look at the repeated impact that comes when we play a sport like netball, with the amount of times you're jumping and landing on one foot during the course of a game and the course of the season. This is where, for example, the repetitive load is going to start to stress the body in ways that aren't ideal. So we need to make sure that the lower limb is strong and stable and is able to deal with this repetitive loading. So now I'm going to talk you through how I would go about doing this. So firstly, we have to start with an adaptation-based approach. A lot of this is inspired or taken from Richard Blagrove's strength and conditioning for endurance runners, but I think it's highly applicable here, and this is the model that he describes in his book. So he talks about starting with the adaptation first. So when we're talking about the foot and ankle, I would primarily classify the adaptations in at least 3 different ways. So firstly, capacity. So this is basically a fancy word for local muscular endurance. The analogy I like to give here is effectively, if you've got a workforce or a team of employees, we're looking at improving their ability to tolerate repetitive demands. So capacity type exercises are going to be high in volume, low in load. So stuff like single leg calf raises, bent leg calf raises, what I call heel to toe walks. All of these you can find on my YouTube channel, or if you drop me a message, I'll send you a link to them. So with capacity work, that's what we're aiming to do. When we get in, once we've built up the muscles and connective tissue to respond to these high volumes and the low intensities, then we're going to start to increase strength. So we're increasing the number of motor units that the body can recruit. So in a simplistic way, if you imagine, for example, your corner shop with, say, 5 employees, then strength training is the equivalent of going from the corner shop to Tesco's, where, I don't know, we've got 100 employees. If we can recruit more muscles or more of the muscle for the task, then we're going to be able to produce a higher level of force output. And most importantly, it's also going to help us absorb a higher level of force. Injuries happen when we expose the body to stress that it is not yet prepared for, whether that's stress in terms of the absolute load, whether it's stress in terms of repetitive load, maybe it's stress in terms of the lines of stress. So for example, what angle is the stress coming from, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. And finally, we've got rate of activation. So for example, how quickly can a task be performed? So rate of activation, or power if you want to be a bit more generic, although not technically the same thing, is basically saying to your employees, how quickly can you produce if we take a factory as an example, how quickly can you take a given unit of input and transfer it into a given unit of output? So rate of activation work is going to be stuff like our plyometrics, getting the body to go from an eccentric to a concentric contraction as quickly as possible with as minimal time wasted, for want of a better word, on the isometric phase where the muscles aren't changing length. Strength training, we're looking stuff at like Smith machine calf raises, bent leg, but seated and weighted calf raises are going to play their part in the strength section. Now, it's not necessarily a case, and Richard made this case on the podcast, that interview that I did with him, that it's not a case of the capacity coming and then we build into strength and then we build into rate of activation, although that is a nice conceptualization. For me, it's about making sure that we're dosing those exercises appropriately at the right times and at the right volumes. So I would say you're doing everything all at the same time, but the emphasis is what changes. So let's just give you an idea of what this might look like. So for example, in phase 1, so I would argue that this is pre-season for a jumping athlete, majority of our work is going to be barefoot conditioning of the foot and ankle. So we're going to be making sure that our exercises are probably stacked back to back to back to back. We're going to have minimal rest. By stacking those exercises back to back, we are getting in high volume of work. We might even disguise this in a warm-up if we're working with younger athletes, and it could just be as simple as, can we design a game which involves being barefoot? So for example, I don't know, barefoot medicine ball passes, barefoot overhead passes, maybe those heel to toe walks that I mentioned. We can get quite funky with these exercises as well. We can go heel to toe, toe to heel. We can start to work on inversions and eversions, providing that the athlete hasn't previously had a history of lateral ankle sprains or has been cleared by physio in order to do this. So at this stage, phase 1, majority of our work is capacity. We're doing about a third of strength work, give or take, and maybe we're using this time to teach proper landing mechanics. The reason why the rate of activation work or the jumping type work is going to be low is because they're going to get a lot of that in season. So there's still enough in there to keep that skill, but we are developing the ability to, I would say, quieten the landings, so absorbing force, making those landings nice and quiet, which we know is a different adaptation to, for example, stiff landings, which I'll get into in a second. So as we move into phase 2, the strength work is going to take over. So for example, we've built the tolerance to the repetitive tasks at low loads. Now we're starting to increase higher loads. So whether this is, for example, jump squats with a little bit of weight, maybe we're using those Smith machine and seated calf raises to target the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So remember, our bent leg calf work is going to target the soleus, our straight leg calf work is going to target the gastroc. And we're going to perhaps start upping the volume of plyometrics here. Maybe we're getting into some harsher landings. So for example, what I call credit card landings, where an athlete will drop off a box and the aim is that you would still be able to slide a credit card or indeed a biscuit underneath their heel. So they're now developing a little bit of stiffness, and maybe we're using these stiffness landings in something like a plyometric circuit, and we're having athletes, for example, if they're in, I don't know, groups of 3 or 4, that's going to keep the work to rest ratio appropriate, so it's not deviating too much into conditioning. We're still going to do a little bit of capacity because again, as myself and Richard discussed on the podcast, if you come away from that, what you'll find is athletes are probably going to start to find that they experience cramps just from the local muscular fatigue if we take this out of the program completely. Finally, in phase 3, we're going to have a higher volume of plyometric stuff. Maybe it's more advanced stuff, which is going to involve shorter contact times, which is going to involve springier returns off the floor, and is possibly going to be single leg in nature. As I said, capacity work might now start to increase just a little bit, although I think you could easily make an argument for the capacity and the strength work being about the same. So not necessarily an exact science with this, but more to say that we're going to build a level of capacity with high volume, low load. Then we're going to go to higher intensities, but bring the load down. And all the while we're building up that volume of in more intense foot and ankle work as we go through. So just as an overview, I would argue that phase 1 is primarily dominated by capacity, so low load, high volume. Phase 2 will be higher loads, lower volumes, and phase 3 will be working on that switching from an eccentric to concentric, quick contacts off the floor, and we're looking to improve the rate of force development. So as I said, how quickly can the employees turn around a specific task? So just generally speaking, we're looking at high force or loaded isometrics in the strength phase. So this might be something as simple as you perform your seated calf raises for say 5 to 8 reps, and on the last rep where you're going very close to failure, you're trying to hold that position static. And ideally, what is key here, and as Dr. Richard Blagrove has mentioned, it might not necessarily be the load per se, but more that we're getting maximum recruitment from that load. So the load at that point is so heavy, you're making the foot and ankle work hard enough where effectively it's trying not to buckle under the load or the fatigue. So phase 1, why? So the ankle is the most common injured joint in netball. I'm sure you're going to see similar things with basketball as well. An inability to sense joint positioning is going to be an injury risk. So this is why we do a lot of stuff barefoot early in the off season, to give the athlete a chance to know where their body is in time and space. A quick tip for you: if you take your athletes out of shoes, it's the first time, get them to close their eyes and put their feet at where they think 12 o'clock is. You'll be surprised. And it's that inability to sense where the joint is without necessarily using the visual system, which is why we see so many injuries. So insufficient ankle strength in the muscles that evert the ankle. So inversion would be falling inwards, eversion would be pulling it back outwards, and a reduced dorsiflexion, so the ability of the knee to travel over the toe, are going to increase the stress on the knees and the feet during landing. So a good test for this is a knee to wall, which I'll pop in the link below. You want to be monitoring that, especially any changes that occur in season. So how are we going to do this? The warm-up is the workout. This is an idea I've stolen from Dan John. So for example, let's say that you are barefoot and the warm-up just consists of a series of foot and ankle drills done bare feet. So for example, you might have heel walks, so where you're literally picking your toes up and walking along with your heels. This is great for conditioning the muscles of the front of the shin. You might then have, for example, what I call high heel walks. So basically, you're on your toes, pushing through your big toe, walking, keeping those heels as high off the floor as possible. You then might have something like what I call an A march, if you will. So going from heel to toe, holding that position for a second or two, pushing through the big toe. By the time you've stacked a few of these together, you're really going to start to feel the muscles around the foot, the ankle, the shin start to work quite hard. So as I've just said there, barefoot conditioning for disguised prehab. The stupid little image I've got with the cauliflower wearing the glasses refers to trying to get kids to eat their vegetables. If you disguise stuff in the warm-up for athletes, they often don't realise that they're doing, shall we say, stuff that looks more towards the rehab end. Finally, in terms of the gradually exposing the foot and ankle to the lines of stress, if we're talking about a lateral ligament sprain, then we need to ensure that excessive inversion, so the foot coming in, and plantar flexion, so the foot being pointed down, is avoided initially, and to make sure we are making sure that athletes stay within these sort of safer planes of motion. Now, this is only for athletes who've struggled or have recently suffered from a lateral ligament sprain. However, if you've done your rehab properly, then you'll realise that when you get into sport, sometimes shit goes down. So you need to think to yourself, it's not a case of if this happens, it's a case of when this happens. So are your athletes prepared? Have they got the mobility, the proprioception, and the strength to deal with awkward joint positions? And you need to ease yourself into those. So what might this session actually look like? Let's just give you a little bit of an example. So the foot and ankle work that I just mentioned there, some traveling arabesques to help integrate the foot with the hip, which is ultimately what it's going to do in sport. We might have some low level hurdle hops. So like to make sure, as I said, we're preparing for the lines of stress by, for example, doing linear hops, so literally just forward, lateral hops, so I would say you want to make sure you're doing the inside foot and outside foot. So for example, if I'm doing my right leg going over the hurdles facing right, my right leg going over the hurdles facing left, and getting in a little bit of a rotational sequence. So in low volumes, we're just dosing those different planes of motion. And finally, just some strength work around the glutes, some single leg strength work, not forgetting that upper body is going to be needed to be in there as well. So when we look at phase 2, what adaptations are we looking to hit upon? We want to increase the motor unit recruitment. So how much of that muscle can you recruit? Because we know the more motor units we can recruit, the more force we can produce, and the more force we can absorb. The more tolerant we are to the high forces involved in sport, the less likely we are to break. So how are we going to do this? We're going to increase the intensity, which means we need to start lifting more weights, or should I say more kilos. We should have already developed technique in phase 1 and we should have conditioned the foot and ankle to higher volumes so we can start to deal with the higher intensities. There should be an emphasis on absorbing force here, so this is where, for example, our rate of activation work or our plyometrics work is going to look more landing based in nature, but we can also work on the force production side, so this is where we're jumping as high or indeed as far as we possibly can. So finally, what would an example session look like in phase 2? So we've extended the mobility a little bit, so we're now looking at something like overhead duck walks. So we're now looking at, as well as the ankle mobility, we're combining that with the rest of the chain. So overhead duck walks, getting in a little bit of rotation and working the hamstrings and the calves along with the foot and ankles. So this might look like, in terms of strength, seated calf raises, Smith machine calf raises, making sure that we are hitting the gastroc and the slayers. Now you might look at these and think, hang on a minute, you've gone for 3 sets of 10, yet you're in a quote-unquote strength block. Because you are on your feet all day, every day, the chances are you're going to need probably a little bit higher volumes than what you'd need for, say, the quadriceps or the chest muscles, whatever. But because they're smaller muscles and because you're on them all day, you might need a little bit more, just in my experience. And finally, as I said, exposing the foot and ankle to lines of stress. So zigzag pogo, so rather than doing pogos where you're bringing your toes up to your nose, you're now going in a zigzag, again, just to gradually introduce those lines of stress. In terms of strength work, we're now still doing our single leg work, but we also have a bilateral stimulus as well. And finally, strength focus for the trunk. So this is where we're using longer levers, so something like an Alekna, or indeed with the banded chop and lift, where we're making sure that the body is strong and stable in a rotational pattern as well. Also, just a final point going back there, in terms of weighted side planks, we know that the lateral chain is going to need to be strong to limit the risk of something like an ACL, not just, for example, the hamstrings and quadriceps, which are close to that area of the body. So phase 3, this is where we are finally improving the rate at which we can develop force. We might need to deload jumping volume depending on how intense technical practice is, so I'd probably put a question mark on that one, depending how far out in the season you are. Let's not use a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. So, for example, if jumping volume is high, because the technical coach is trying to prepare athletes for the season, there's no need for us to replicate this in the gym. In fact, we'd probably almost be better doing the opposite. I like to take an approach where we are kind of 6 weeks ahead of what the technical coach is going to be doing. So for example, if the technical coach is planning on upping plyometric volume, whether they realize that that's what they're doing or not, we almost want to make sure the athlete has had exposure to this, so we don't go from 0 to 100 real quick. So I think if we get clever with our exercise selection, we can avoid overkill, and we want to focus on explosive release phase in our plyometric work. So this is where we are trying to focus on going as high or as fast as possible. And like I said, a minimal effective dose of strength work, just to make sure that we are not getting weaker during the season. So this is what that might look like. As I said, clever variations. So rear for elevated split squat, we're getting load and we're getting mobility through that back quadricep. A lateral lunge to curtsy squat, so now we're developing range in multiple planes of motion. As I said, we're still keeping a rotational element to our jump and landings, and our hamstring work is now looking more closely like the sport-specific velocities. Again, you're not going to match sprinting in the weight room, so make sure your athletes are sprinting at the same time as well. Again, with our clever variation, so a reverse lunge to a step up, you're obviously going to use less load than something like a back squat, so psychologically it might not feel as heavy as the previous block. And we're also starting to link in other elements of the chain with our mental support work. Hopefully you found that useful, and you can see how having an adaptation approach is going to help you reduce the risk of injuries, rather than just saying, oh, what are the 3 best foot and ankle exercises? What adaptation are you trying to achieve? Then you can decide what prescription is appropriate. Remember, capacity work is going to be high volume, low load. Strength work is going to be obviously high loads, probably moderate-ish volume, and your rate of activation work, that is high intensity and low volume. If you've enjoyed this, please share it with a coach that you think will benefit from it. Hit subscribe, and if you would like to get in touch, then my details are on the screen. Thank you very much for listening. Catch you again in the next episode of Wisdom Wednesdays.